Hello, everybody. So today I wanted to go over the reading on Racializing Latinos by Kovas, Dwani, and Joe Fagan. This is a very important reading as we move forward, as we begin really getting, before we jump into our textbook, because this concept of racialization, I really want to really set the ground for our understanding on what that is and how it works in the political realm. Okay, so for as we begin to think about this concept, so the definition of racialization, and I combined a couple of definitions here from Ramon Grosvogel, who teaches in the Ethnic Studies Department at Berkeley, and Gobas Dwani and Fagan that you read. So Grosvogel tells us it's a process in which dominant groups utilize cultural and biological features to construct levels of superiority and inferiority. So specifically, the racialization of Latinos refers to their definition as a racial group and the denigration of their alleged physical and cultural characteristics such as phenotype, the way one appears, language, the way one speaks, or number of children, including all that. So this is the concept of racialization and how it applies to those who are marked by it. And when I speak of racialization, I really want us to focus on how it works in relation to power. It's not simply defining people in how they look or speak just for to mark their differences. It is utilized in order, as Grosvogel points out, to construct the levels of superior and inferior. So what is racism? A basic working definition given by the abolitionist Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore. So racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. We know when we're speaking of racism, now when a group is racialized, laws are created, institutions that exclude them or that target them to produce differential outcomes for those groups. When we're looking at the United States social political system, we're looking at a hierarchy. There are groups that are at the top and those at the bottom and in between. So there is a structured hierarchy, and some we know are measurable. We can measure literally their life expectancy depending on the zip code. That's in the United States in 2020, which is a very harrowing realization. So this concept that Fagan et al. Give us in this introductory piece, and again, this is the introduction to a book, but it provides a really good, brief, historical overview of the ideas of racial difference and what we're moving now into the political aspect, how they have placed Latinas, Latinos, and the Latinx population in a specific predicament, right? So our goal is to understand how inequality was structured by law, by policy, by practice, by belief, and what to do about it. Now political action will be that's the second realm. But first we have to understand the problem, so to speak. We have to diagnose it, much as a medical doctor would diagnose the body in order to understand what ails it. We are understanding the U.S. political formation at its founding moment in order to remedy it, if it is possible, or maybe it is too cancerous. So we will discuss a lot of these issues as we move forward. So the white racial frame. Fagan's definition, it's an organized set of racialized ideas, stereotypes, emotions, and incriminations to discriminate. Critical or inclinations to discriminate. Critical to the white racial frame is an interrelated set of cognitive notions, understandings, and metaphors that whites have used to rationalize and legitimate systemic racism, or what I call white supremacy. White supremacy as the social, political, and economic system. I'll elaborate more on that as we move forward. But systemic racism is a term that is being used in society today, and has been used for lots of times. Very long time. What Fagan et al. Tell us in this brief piece is how the idea of race really entered the domain and its trajectory into affecting Latino populations commencing in the 19th century in the US Southwest. But before that, the idea of inferiority emerges in Europe, right? And in this very brief piece, we have here a very important philosopher in our history, the Enlightenment thinker Immanuel Kant, who grand contributions to rational thinking and philosophy in general, but he also had various ideas about the inferiority of peoples. And you read in Immanuel Kant, on page 3, where Immanuel Kant discusses the differences in human genus, right? Where he speaks of there are specific traits that make the Negroes stink. They are lazy, right? So they are, what Fagan is telling us, this early type of white racial framing begins to take shape in the Americas, right? And it's transferred to other folks. Specifically for us, you're thinking about Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of, one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. But he was a slaveholder. We know he sexually violated his female slaves and had children with them. But he had an idea of the racial inferiority of his slaves, right? And although he was kind of tormented and believed in a kind of universal belief in humanity, that idea of equality before the Constitution and how to develop the United States was really dependent upon structuring inequality for those who he did not see and others did not see as human equals, right? And here's a passage from the Notes on the State of Virginia, which you read. He says, "I think one black could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid in mathematics, and in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. So physical and mentally they are inferior." So Thomas Jefferson has racialized the black population as carrying these traits, and therefore they cannot enter the realm of U.S. citizenship or even on a level of equality. And therefore justifying or rationalizing their non-payment and relegating them to servitude, and maintaining that system of bondage. So this is the founding of the nation. And as we're thinking about how that affects Latinos specifically, where we're going to be moving, and Fagan et al. Point to the first and largest group that entered the U.S. polity, Mexicans, right? So J.W.F. Hegel is a very influential philosopher also in Western philosophy, and influenced, amongst others, famously Karl Marx. But he also had ideas about those who were non-European, right? And here's a passage that I took from the Argentinian Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel, where he quoted Hegel as noting that regarding America, especially Mexico or Peru, and its degree of civilization, our information indicates that its culture expires the moment the spirit draws near. The inferiority of these individuals is, in every respect, is entirely evident. So that inferior level, the racialization, just in the idea, because Hegel had not met a Mexican or an indigenous person, but Hegel had the idea that was passed on by previous ideas about the savages in the Americas, commencing with that moment of contact in 1492 when Columbus depicted this in his travel logs and in his stories, and that just took on new shape after that in the 15th and 16th centuries. So here he is in the late 18th and early 19th century, still transmitting the ideas of the inferiority of these populations, which again, therefore, would set the ground for the rationalization of taking that empty land in the Southwest where we reside, where the indigenous existed, the Mexican existed. So these ideas of racialization and conquest coming together, as I was describing, this is where Mexicans fell victim as the first Latin American group to enter. But again, Mexicans and Spanish, who had set up under Spanish rule, had established the mission system and the encomienda system in Mexico, was also placed on a system of racial and economic hierarchy. But right now, I want us to focus on how the U.S. racial making was really developed. And from page 5, what the authors tell us is that as the oldest and largest group in Latin American origin in the United States, Mexicans have undergone the longest and most sustained history of racial oppression amongst Latinos. So it wasn't only that moment of the taking of their land, but it was the subsequent forms of racial violence. Here in California, we're not far away, and we're in the territories where hundreds of Mexicans were lynched. We know thousands of Mexicans were lynched. Those numbers are still being tallied. We're going to be reading about that as we move through our course. And one thing that we really don't learn in our U.S. history courses is that, as the historians William Kerrigan and Clive Webb note, that the lynchings of Mexican and Mexican Americans are as central to our history as lynchings are to the African American experience in the United States. And the numbers are pretty high. So we'll be talking more about that as we move forward. And this myth of racial inferiority helped to justify the U.S. conquest of a large part of Mexico's territory, as well as the low status of Mexican Americans in the racial hierarchy of the emerging Southwest. You will also be reading Lisa Garcia Bedoya's book and her chapter on Mexican Americans to see how that was made. But one of the key ideas that led to the dispossession of not only indigenous peoples, but also of Mexicanos and Mexicanas in this period was the idea of manifest destiny, that it was the Anglos' God-ordained or God-given right from them to take this land from sea to shining sea. And here you have Lady Liberty really crossing, bringing light to all the backward and uncivilized, darkened people of the earth. So this is a very famous painting of John Gast titled American Progress, 1872. So we still have these contrasts in American society today when we're thinking of progress. What is progress? What does modernity mean? And for those who weren't deemed to be modern, it basically meant death, either death physically or death culturally, economically, socially, and politically. And we'll be expanding on that. But this concept of manifest destiny remains so powerful and remains at play in our political realm. As we're looking how it's expanded not only from sea to shining sea, but the entire globe and even into outer space. And on this incorporation, this idea of the racialization specifically of indigenous peoples and Mexicans in the territory was a big debate. And after the taking of the Mexican territories here in the Southwest, California, Texas, Nuevo Mexico, Arizona, parts of what is Arizona now, parts of Oregon, Wyoming, Oklahoma, all these territories were seeing, there was a big debate happening. The United States Marines are in Mexico City. They had taken the land, and there's a big debate raging in Congress where John C. Calhoun, who was a former vice president, senator, very powerful, made a case against incorporating the Mexicans because he saw them as inferior. And this is what you read on page 4, right? That we have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of this kind. I protest against such a union because this would be the downfall or would be fatal to our institution, said John C. Calhoun. And his debate, his argument won out because they ended up taking only the least populated territories here in the Southwest, not all of Mexico. And this is where historians note that racism actually saved Mexico in this moment because the idea, they wanted the land, but they didn't want the people, the Mexicans. And where there were too numerous of Mexicans, which is down in the mainland, they said, hold back, let them keep that, we'll take this. And from that, as we're looking at the racialization now, even into law, a fundamental piece of law was Plessy v. Ferguson, or the separate but equal doctrine. Juan Crow and Jim Crow will be talking more about how this set the ground for separation by race, making it legal. And this is some of the signs from Texas and to common present-day Arizona. In the U.S. war with Spain, we go on to see how Puerto Rico, Cuba was racialized. And then the concept of illegal alien that really faces on page 7, you can see how immigrant and foreign status has become central to the racialized idea of Latin Americans and how this notion of illegality leads to violence, right? So we've read about we remember this massacre recently, and we'll pick it up from here as we're moving forward.